So today I'm doing this talk with you called How to Think About Sex. And it is quite a strange way for me to think about it because I don't want to come across as instructing you, this is how you must think about sex, because precisely my point is that there isn't a particular way of thinking about sex. This is a way of subverting or changing the dominant or conventional way of thinking about sex. So why am I so interested in this? So it's one of those things whereby I'm so completely fascinated by philosophy and also completely fascinated by sex. And I want to understand. So I'm really drawn to understanding about sexuality. And I have this very love-hate relationship with philosophy, which I think will really come through here. I think there's good reason for it. So the first sort of question that comes to mind when I think about thinking and sex is why are the rules and why is the basis for the rules when thinking about sex so rigid? And this is it's a solid body of thought which we try and apply to something that is so fluid. Something so fluid like human sexuality, something so bodily, and we're trying to apply this text and this big canon of thought that is made up of all these books and thinking and logic, and we're trying to apply that to something that's not that. It's something very bodily and unpredictable. So I'm really interested in how to bring these things together and what has happened when we have tried to bring these things together. First of all, I just want to talk about where philosophy fits in the general kind of framework when thinking about sex. So why philosophy? Why have I chosen philosophy to put with sex, given that I've just pointed to a real mismatch in the two things? So there are various places from which rules come from. So we've got politics and society, and that's something we're quite accustomed to turning to when we want to understand sexuality or identities, how these identities are contested, all the battles that go on in relation to gender politics, sexuality, and so on. We also have religion, which is a big factor when we come to talk about society and politics, because of course the rules and so on in relation to various religions feed into society and politics. And all of this is kind of, I would say, bound together by law as well. So all of these things influence the law. So what is right and what is wrong, particularly when we come to thinking about sex. And this in turn then leads to how we consider ethics in sexuality. So how and what we are allowed to do, how we are allowed to feel, who we're allowed to have sex with, who we're not allowed to have sex with. And I would like to do sort of quotes here as in allowed, as in what does the law say, what does the political situation say, what does society say about this. So these are various things that we can turn to. And what I would suggest is that philosophy underpins all of these things. It's particular ways of thinking and values that we hold out as being important. And these values, they tend to feed into, they don't just exist in this textual format in all these books that we see in libraries or on our bookshelves. It's not just in volumes of philosophy, and it's not just in law books and so on where these rules exist, but we embody them. So not only do we read them, we hear about them on the news, on the radio, whatever. We're exposed to them as we're growing up. Other people are also exposed to them. So we're socialized into a particular set of rules. And so we embody them. They become part of the way that we move. And as it relates to sexuality, so bringing this back to how this impacts our sexuality and our desire, is that certain things like, for instance, the presumption of heterosexuality, there's presumptions about monogamy, ways in which we think desires are allowed and not allowed, so kink and BDSM, masturbation, all of these things that people might think of as taboo or might not feel like they fit within these things. So it has this impact of making us think that certain things are allowed and certain things are not. It's something that feeds through the media as well. It's all of these messages that we get are all underpinned by a certain philosophical way of thinking. So we've got the way that our bodies then move, and then we've got the foundation of all of that. So kind of the architecture of all that, the architecture of the rules. And so going back to that, so it doesn't come out of the sky, it's written, it's also embodied. So when we think about philosophy, we tend to think about, I expect when you think about philosophy, you think of philosophers. So who some of these philosophers might be. So we might start with Aristotle, who is widely known as the grandfather of philosophy, sort of one of philosophy's fathers. And perhaps one of the biggest figures in philosophy. But he's not just alone. So he's perhaps at the very start. We have a long lineage that builds up the canon of what we understand as being Western philosophy. Aristotle, Kant, all these big names that we think of when we think philosophy. So what I'm trying to say here is that philosophy kind of feeds its way into the political and societal environment that we live in, and it informs what our ethical codes are in relation to one another. So there's a whole corpus, if you like, of philosophy. It's a whole body that moves, but also that we are interconnected with. And you might think, well, okay, that's great. I mean, whatever. There's a relationship between philosophy and sexuality. There's a relationship between philosophy and politics and society. So what? Who cares? It's important because of the way it informs our judgments about sexuality. So if we think about sexuality as that which founds our ways of thinking, we can think about sexuality as informing what we think of as morality. And once we understand what we think of as morality, this becomes then a standard. It's not just a standard by which we judge others. So if we accept morality as being important, and something that is either, depending on your philosophical school, it might be something that comes from God, it might be something that we all accept as human beings as being some kind of moral consensus, which obviously it isn't, because we all have different ideas of what morality is. Or perhaps there's a philosophical school of thought that says, well, there's actually certain key aspects of morality that we can all agree on as human beings. But then those are also contested, right? Or does it come from somewhere else? Or is it just something that we arrive at throughout our daily lives and think, okay, well, this seems to be the right moral code through which to live? Which is all very well, it sounds kind of quite neat. But then if we think about sexuality, which is something that we're all so different, we have so many different desires, so many different identities, so many different experiences. Each person is completely individual, completely unique in this respect. So how can we possibly say that some moral objective standard can apply to us all? And yet philosophically that's supported. So the problem with morality then is that we then have judgment that comes after that. So if we say that the standard is this, then obviously logically, and it tends to be a human thing to say, well, this person has infringed this part of the moral code, so our judgment is that their identity, their desire is wrong. It is outside of what we accept as being allowed. So these kind of rules, what could they be? So in relation to sexuality, this might be about fidelity and monogamy. So it's about, okay, well, if you're with one person, you can't desire somebody else. And this is something that if we look back into the lineage of philosophy and religion, we can see this rule feeding throughout. So it's about desire. It's also about when we have sex, who we have sex with. And through these kind of judgments, what happens is that through the authority of these judgments.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.